The story begins not in Jerusalem, but in Babylon, a city of power, wealth, and pride. The Israelites had been taken captive, their temple destroyed, their nation humiliated. Among the captives were young men of royal and noble families. They were intelligent, strong, and skilled, and the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, wanted to use their gifts for his empire. So they were taken from their homes, taught the language of Babylon, given new names, and trained to serve the king. Among them were 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But the Babylonians gave them new names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, names meant to erase their identity, to sever their connection with the God of Israel. But names alone could not change the faith in their hearts. Day after day, they lived surrounded by idols, rituals, and customs of a foreign land. Everywhere they turned, they were reminded that they were strangers in Babylon, and yet they remained faithful. They served with excellence. They honored the king in their work, but in their hearts, they belonged to a higher king. This is where our story begins. In a land of exile, under the shadow of the world's greatest empire, with 3 young men whose loyalty to God was about to be tested in fire. King Nebuchadnezzar was not only powerful, he was proud. His empire stretched across nations. His armies were feared. His palaces glittered with wealth. But power breeds pride, and pride often demands worship. So the king devised a plan. He ordered an image to be built, not of stone, not of bronze, but of pure gold. It rose higher than any building in the land, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. Its surface reflected the sunlight like fire. From miles away, travelers could see it shining, a monument to the glory of Babylon and to the ego of its king. This was more than art. This was a statement. Nebuchadnezzar was declaring himself above all gods, worthy of the worship of every nation under his rule. He sent messengers to every province. They carried scrolls sealed with a royal mark, summoning governors, generals, judges, treasurers, and advisors. No one was exempt. If you had authority in Babylon, you were commanded to appear before the statue. On the plain of Dura, preparations began. The vast field was cleared, torches lit, banners of Babylon raised high. Rows of soldiers stood like pillars, ensuring order. The golden statue loomed in the center, casting its shadow across the earth, as if to say, "All must bow beneath me." The day arrived. From distant lands they came, crowds of thousands, men and women of every tongue and culture. They gathered, a sea of humanity under the blazing sun. Nebuchadnezzar himself stood at the forefront, his crown gleaming, his pride swelling as he looked upon his creation. This was not simply loyalty he was demanding, it was worship. Then came the decree, proclaimed with trumpets, peoples, nations, and men of every language. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. A hush fell over the crowd. The words were clear. There would be no mercy. Obedience meant survival. Disobedience meant death. Then the music began. First the soft call of the flute, then the deep echo of the horns, the clash of cymbals, the strumming of harps, until the air shook with sound. At once, the sea of people moved as one, like wheat bowing to the wind. They dropped to their knees. Tens of thousands pressed their faces to the dust, arms stretched out before the statue, voices whispering prayers to a god of gold. The plain that had moments before been filled with chatter was now silent except for the music and the crackle of torches in the wind. But in the midst of that endless bowing, 3 figures remained upright. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They stood tall, their backs straight, their eyes lifted not to the statue, but to the unseen God of heaven. Their refusal was not hidden. It was unmistakable. In a sea of bent bodies, their defiance shone like a flame. People gasped. Whispers raced through the crowd. Why are they still standing? Don't they know the punishment? Don't they fear the furnace? The music continued, But for those watching, the sound was drowned out by the sight of three men who would not bow. They knew the cost. They knew the danger. But they also knew something greater, that no king, no idol, no threat of death was worthy of the worship that belonged to their God alone. And as the last note of music faded, they remained unmoved. The music faded. The crowd slowly rose, brushing dust from their robes. But the whispers did not stop. All around the plain, people were pointing. Three men had not bowed. Three men had stood tall before the king's golden image. At first, some thought it was a mistake. Perhaps they hadn't heard the music. Perhaps they were distracted. But the truth was clear. They had refused. And in every crowd, there are always those eager to accuse. The Chaldeans, advisors of the king, men jealous of the favor Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego held, seized the opportunity. They rushed forward, faces burning with anger, hearts filled with envy. This was their chance to destroy the men who had risen so high in the king's service. They entered the great hall of Nebuchadnezzar, where the king sat on his throne, still proud of the great spectacle he had commanded. The Chaldeans bowed low, their voices dripping with flattery. "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that when the music played, all peoples and nations should bow and worship the golden image, and that whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into the blazing furnace." Nebuchadnezzar nodded, pleased with the reminder of his power. But then came the sting of betrayal. "But there are certain Jews, whom you have set over the affairs of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They pay no attention to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, nor do they worship the golden image you have set up." The words echoed in the hall. The king's eyes widened, his jaw tightened. At first, he could not believe it. These were men he had honored, men he had trusted with authority. But now, they had defied him publicly, in front of the entire empire. Nebuchadnezzar's face darkened. The veins in his neck swelled. His fury rose like fire. "Bring them to me," he roared. Soldiers marched out immediately, their armor clanging, their spears flashing in the light. They pushed through the crowd at the plain of Dura, seized Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and dragged them before the king. The court was silent as the three young men stood before Nebuchadnezzar. His anger burned in his eyes. But even so, he gave them one more chance. "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, or worship the golden image I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, then all will be well. But if you do not worship it, you will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. And tell me this, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The challenge was clear. The test was set before the watching eyes of Babylon and before the throne of a furious king. The three young men had a choice: to bow or to burn. The throne room of Babylon was silent. The flames of the torches flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of stone. Nebuchadnezzar's question still hung heavy in the air. "And what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The crowd trembled. No one dared to breathe, for in Babylon, the king's word was law, and to defy him was to choose death. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before him. Three young men among an empire of millions. They had no army to defend them, no wealth to bribe their way out, no political power to sway the king. By every measure of the world, they were powerless. And yet, there was a power burning within them, greater than the armies of Babylon, greater than the gold of the statue, greater even than the fire of the furnace. It was faith. Faith not in themselves, but in the living God of heaven and earth. Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Bow and live, refuse and die. The choice was clear. But for them, the choice was already made. Without hesitation, without fear, they answered in voices that carried through the hall. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image you have set up." The words thundered through the court. The crowd gasped. The king's advisors exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke to Nebuchadnezzar this way. But these men were not speaking to preserve their lives. They were speaking to preserve their faith. Look closely at their words. They did not say, "We hope our God might save us." They did not say, "Perhaps he will come to our rescue." No, they declared with certainty, "Our God is able." This was confidence in God's power. They knew he was not limited by kings or kingdoms, by fire or furnace, by threats or swords. Their God was the creator of heaven and earth, and if he willed, he could deliver them in an instant. But then came words even more extraordinary. "But even if he does not," pause and consider that. Faith is easy when rescue is guaranteed. Trust is simple when victory is certain. But real faith, the faith that shakes empires, is the kind that says, even if God does not save us as we expect, we will still trust him. Even if the fire consumes us, we will not bow. Even if our story ends here, our loyalty remains with him. This is not shallow belief. This is deep conviction. This is worship that cannot be bought by promises of comfort or silenced by threats of pain. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not serving God for what he could do, but for who he is. Their devotion was not conditional on a miracle. It was anchored in eternal truth, that God alone is worthy of worship. The court was stunned. Some whispered, "Surely they will bow now to save themselves, to spare their families." But their answer was final. Their faith was sealed. Imagine the courage it took to stare into the eyes of a furious king, with soldiers armed and ready, with the roaring of the furnace echoing in the distance, and still declare, "We will not bow." They stood not just for themselves, but for every believer who would one day face persecution. Their story would echo through the ages as a testimony that true faith cannot be threatened into silence. Nebuchadnezzar's face twisted with rage. His pride had been wounded, his command defied, his authority challenged in front of the entire empire. But the three young men did not waver. Their eyes were steady, their hearts at peace, their voices calm, their lives in the hands of God, and in his hands they were safe, whether in life or in death. Heaven itself leaned in to listen, for in that moment, on the plains of Babylon, faith rose higher than fear, and the choice was made. They would rather burn in fire with God than bow in comfort without him. Nebuchadnezzar could no longer contain himself. The calm defiance of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ignited a fire of fury within him far hotter than the furnace itself. His face twisted with rage. His voice thundered through the hall. "Heat the furnace 7 times hotter than usual." The command was absurd. The furnace was already blazing, a monstrous pit designed for destruction. But the king's wrath demanded excess. He would not merely punish them. He would make their deaths a spectacle. Servants and soldiers rushed to obey. Bellows pumped. Fuel was piled high. Flames leapt higher and higher, licking the sky with violent tongues of fire. The heat grew unbearable. The air shimmered around the opening of the furnace. Waves of scorching heat, bending the view like liquid glass. The roar of the fire was deafening, as if the furnace itself were alive. Hungry, angry, waiting to consume, the king ordered his strongest warriors to bind the 3 men. These were no ordinary soldiers, but the fiercest in his army, men hardened by battle, accustomed to blood and fire. With ropes they tied Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, hands bound, feet shackled. Still, the 3 did not resist. They offered no fight, for their trust was not in escape, but in God. The soldiers dragged them toward the furnace. Every step closer, the heat grew more unbearable. Those standing nearby shielded their faces, sweat pouring down, the smell of smoke filling the air. Nebuchadnezzar's eyes blazed with cruel satisfaction. He believed he had won. He believed their faith would end in ashes. But faith that is tested by fire is faith that shines brightest. As the soldiers approached the mouth of the furnace, the flames leapt outward with sudden violence. The heat was so fierce, so overwhelming, that it consumed the mighty men themselves. The strongest warriors of Babylon fell dead at the very door of the furnace, slain not by sword, but by the fire they had meant for others. And still, bound and helpless, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were hurled into the flames. The crowd gasped in horror. This was the end. No one survived the furnace. Not even the soldiers could withstand its fury. Surely, within moments, nothing would remain of the three young men, but ashes carried on the wind. But heaven was not silent. What man meant for destruction, God was about to use for revelation. As the flames wrapped around them, something extraordinary happened. The fire did not consume them. The ropes burned away, but their clothes did not ignite. Their hair was not singed. Not even the smell of smoke touched them. The fire that destroyed the strongest warriors of Babylon could not harm the servants of the Most High. And then a fourth figure appeared. Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet, his eyes wide in shock. He turned to his advisors, his voice trembling. "Did we not throw 3 men bound into fire?" "Certainly, O king," they replied. "But look," he cried, "I see 4 men unbound, walking the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." The impossible was unfolding before their eyes. In the very heart of the furnace, God himself had drawn near. The presence of the divine walked among them. What was meant to destroy them became the very place of encounter. The fire roared like a living beast, its flames twisting upward as if to consume the heavens. The crowd shielded their faces, expecting screams, expecting silence, expecting death. But instead, a murmur began, first from one corner, then another. People leaned forward, straining their eyes. "Wait, do you see that? Look closer. They're not 3, but 4. Gasps rippled through the assembly. The murmurs grew into shouts. And Nebuchadnezzar himself, seated high upon his throne, stood to his feet in disbelief. His eyes widened. His lips trembled as he pointed toward the blazing furnace. "Did we not throw 3 men bound into fire?" he demanded. "Certainly, O king," his advisors stammered, their own voices shaking with fear. Nebuchadnezzar's voice broke with awe. "But look, I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are unharmed. And the fourth looks like a son of the gods." The crowd turned their gaze again, and what they saw defied all reason. Inside the inferno, where the strongest soldiers of Babylon had perished instantly, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked freely. The ropes that had bound them were gone, burned away by the fire, yet not a thread of their garments was touched. Their hair remained intact, their skin untouched. They were not frantic, not desperate, but calm, peaceful, as if walking in a field beneath the sun. And with them, a figure radiant with heavenly glory. He walked beside them, between them, surrounding them. The flames bent away from him, as though creation itself recognized his authority. The very fire that should consume them became instead a backdrop for divine presence. The people fell silent. A holy stillness settled over the plain of Dura. The only sound was a crackling of fire, a fire that obeyed the command of a greater master. Nebuchadnezzar could not look away. The man who thought himself divine was now trembling before the sight of the divine. His knees weakened, his heart pounded. For the first time, he realized his power was nothing. Before him stood a miracle he could not control. He shouted, his voice cracking with both fear and reverence. "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." The crowd held its breath. And then, out of the furnace, through the wall of flames, the 3 young men stepped, not crawling, not staggering, but walking upright, their heads lifted high. As they emerged, The officials of Babylon surged forward. Governors, satraps, and prefects crowded around, each desperate to see with their own eyes. They leaned close, touching the garments of the men, sniffing the air. No burns, no smoke, not even the faintest smell of fire clung to them. It was impossible. It was undeniable. The very fire that had reduced their finest soldiers to ashes had failed to touch these three men of faith. And Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, was undone. His booming voice, once filled with pride, now carried awe and reverence. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives, rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that no people, no nation, no language is to speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for no other God can save in this way. The same king who demanded worship of gold now proclaimed the glory of the living God. The same lips that had mocked were now declaring praise, and all of Babylon heard it. The empire of idols, the kingdom of gold and pride, was forced to acknowledge the God who walks with his people through the fire.